Hey there! Graphics have always been at the center of gaming. A source of hype, of technological advance, of change. But that seems to be over. Today they have lost their edge, to the point that they are getting pushed aside. This makes no sense, because tech today is amazing. I mean, I grew up making computers play video games they didn't have any business playing. Only able to imagine how they would look at max settings with frame rates that didn't feel like a PowerPoint. But those days are over, as today we can get a GPU that will pretend to have better resolution and more frames to gaslight us into thinking games run great. But you have to wonder, what's happening when the new top-of-the-line GPU, costing double my entire computer, eating 3 times the power and being an excellent room heater, until it melts, has to fake it to make a last-gen game run smooth? And yes, the cutting edge always had absurd requirements, which made sense when new games were mind-blowing. But today? When so many of the most power-hungry, RAM-devouring, hard-drive-crushing AAA games are so soulless that you can compare them with classics from decades ago and they lose in everything, sometimes even in looks. Modern gaming has a problem with graphics, and when Nintendo quadruples down on ditching the hardware race and Valve starts betting on low-end tech, you know things are getting weird. So let's talk about why this is happening and how graphics are failing from both a commercial and a psychological standpoint, and why this is something to be a bit optimistic about. But don't worry, this is not a graphics don't matter video, that's bullshit, unless you truly believe text adventures to be the peak of gaming. Graphics do matter, a lot, until they start getting in their own way. And this can only happen because the industry seems to be forgetting what they are even supposed to do. Plain and simple, graphics are just visual information, and in gaming that comes in 3 types. The 3 pillars of graphics, if you are feeling fancy. The first pillar is functional information. This is the most important one, as it tells us everything we need to know. Where we are, where we can go, what we can interact with, what might kill us, and all the extra detail like health, lives, and so on. Good design will show you all this at first glance, while bad design will piss you off with invisible walls, trash hitboxes, and unreliable visuals. This is also the pillar that needs the least amount of detail to work. You can do with simple shapes for 2D, basic polygons with minimal textures for 3D. Just look at Dwarf Fortress. Mastering this game should count as a degree in masochism, and the main branch looks like this. The second pillar is narrative information. It's the show don't tell, pure and simple. It's what conveys the mood, the background of a place, what's happening and how characters feel about it without a single word. Good design will show you in a fraction of a second that this guy is an asshole and this one's pretty pissed. That this world is fucked up, that this guy is poor, that this is not a serious game, and so on. This takes more power, but we got there in the 90s for pixel art, 2000s for 3D, and between there and the early 2010s for lifelike human expression. The third pillar is aesthetic information. The bling, the looks, the jiggle. Anything that's there to make a game look in a certain way, be it beautiful or beautifully ugly. Here's where the sky's the limit. But in truth, graphics only need to be as good as the style chosen requires. Which, outside of photorealistic games or simulators, the bar is not that high. Besides, pushing this pillar too hard can hurt the other two, which is never worth it. With this in mind, when we talk about more graphics, it just means more detail, fidelity and tech behind that visual information. And no matter the complexity, the goal is always the same, communicating those 3 types of information. But today, the fancy people will tell you graphics don't matter. What matters is gameplay and style. Which, yes, video games are interactive art. In other words, a combination of gameplay and style. But without graphics you wouldn't even have those. And I don't mean it in the silly way of you wouldn't see them on the screen. Let me unpack this. Gameplay is how the game plays.
Well, duh.
And for style, well, if you don't know what it is, you don't have it. Style is just the result of the conscious effort of making something feel in a certain way. The way doesn't matter. You can create something consistent where everything matches like in a classical painting. You can mix hand drawings with pixel characters on classic 3D environments and modern effects. There are no rules, but to pull it off requires a fuck ton of thought. Visuals, music, gameplay and storytelling, everything has to be in sync to make us go wow, as we realize that every scene is there to tell us something. In other words, style is what gives a piece of art its identity, or if you want to be cheesy, its soul. So yeah, it's easy to say graphics don't matter while you enjoy a retro-looking indie survival horror, But those wouldn't even exist if some fellas from the 90s weren't pushing graphics to the limit with Alone in the Dark. In the same way, nothing inspired by Silent Hill would be the same if the foggy town wasn't foggy to deal with the limitations of the PS1. The truth is that most styles and gameplays are the result of a team from the past trying to make some new graphical tech play and look great. Graphics are also one of the things that forced the development of better tools to design games as they became more complex. More fancy tools means more toys for creating stuff with less effort in the hands of creative people, to the point where a single person can create a whole game, which is what made the indie world explode. So of course they matter. But then, the question is, how did we go from that into graphics hurting both gameplay and style, while more and more gamers don't give a fuck about them anymore? In other words, how did we get to the breaking point? Well, this becomes clear with a quick peek at the history of home gaming. The beginnings were dark, with consoles that didn't know what the hell they were trying to be, and PCs loading cassettes that played this beautiful noise for half an hour while you prayed they didn't crash, which was a quick way to become an atheist. Quality control was so awful that video game magazines advertised vodka in case you needed to ease your suffering, and even on those tender days, they were flexing graphics.
On an Atari home video game system, you'll see amazing graphics, like this.
But then, a shoebox called Nintendo Entertainment System single-handedly brought home gaming into a golden era. A very, very long one. After that is when the obsession with graphics truly started. Think about it, if I tell you that my game has a lot of style, your brain just put me in the box of people who really like the smell of their own farts. If I tell you that the gameplay is great, you don't have any reason to believe me. But graphics hit you in the face, which was especially true at that time when a couple of magazine pages were all you had to showcase a game. So yes, the reason why graphics have always been at the center is pure and simple marketing. They are visual, you can show how your game is the new big thing, and use them to trigger emotion in a couple of pictures. So every new device was flexing them. I mean, there was a time where every console had Super, Mega or Turbo in the name, bragging about the number of bits they had.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
Did we know what bits were? Hell no. Just that we were
Playing with power. Superpower.
Graphics sold games and consoles, but we kept buying because that wasn't the only thing that evolved. Gameplay became tighter, faster, more fluid and varied. Animations went from nothing to competing with movies. Music from chiptunes to full-blown orchestral arrangements. 3D became a thing. Physics evolved like crazy, same with narrative, enemy AI, cinematics, style, even controllers. Online multiplayer exploded, and devs were trying to make games more and more optimized, pushing systems to the point where an early game and a late game from the same console were worlds apart. And the PC world was no different. They were trying to push everything to the extreme, even efficiency. This demo might not look impressive, but what if I tell you that taking a screenshot creates a file that's 7 times bigger than the whole demo? Gaming was a race to do more, and even more with less. Every year blew the previous one, and tech limitations forced studios to nail style or look like crap, so they did. Let's just say, if you were into gaming back then, you were hyped. Period. But this era peaked in the mid-2000s, and after that it slowed down into 20 years of small graphical improvements, while the rest stayed the same. Which you'll agree is not as exciting. This was also the point where gaming finally went from passionate geeks doing cool stuff into becoming the biggest entertainment industry in the world. Here's where game studios became corporations, and feel free to tell me which one of the legendary studios of the past hasn't become a greedy shadow of what it once was. The hobby for nerds turned into the ultimate business, so they slowed down innovation on everything not related to selling more games. This meant more graphics for marketing, plus making games more casual, plus betting on what worked before, so we got the remake era. Here is where consoles also stopped feeling special and became dumb PCs with the same games all across. Still, corporations are quite good at refining the things that work, so we still got a silver age full of polished gems. But this changed mainstream gaming forever. as we basically crossed from selling interactive pieces of art into just purely games as products. The biggest example being mobile games, but I already talked about that in another video. The key thing here is that development stopped focusing on innovation and went all in into making games with less effort and time. Graphics are still the main marketing point, as they are the only thing that changes, even if just a little. But the question around them stopped being how do we make this look amazing, and became what software can we create so even underpaid interns can make something that looks nice. Just take a look at the three most hyped graphical technologies of today. Upscaling, which is playing at lower resolutions and making your graphics card pretend you are not. FrameGen, which is making your graphics card pretend your game runs smooth. And ray tracing/path tracing, which allow developers to implement light with a fraction of the effort. None of this new tech is to make games better in any way. It's only there to compensate for bad or lazy design, and the more they are able to compensate, the less optimized games will get, which will sell more GPUs. It's kind of brilliant if you think about it. The whole phenomenon of AAA games that look worse but eat more is just a result of all this. Just unoptimized, bloated games that are so rushed they release half broken. They are basically producing turds and making tech polish them. But this is not only about bad games. Even great games are now developed in stupid ways. Look at the remake of Silent Hill 2. It's stunning, but a bit of a hog. Why? Well, if you remove the fog, you'll see how the game renders huge areas all the time, which makes zero sense. Just compare it with how the original used fog as a way to only render what was necessary, and you'll see how lazy they have become. But you know, gaming is not like social media or big tech, where they can piss on their audience and tell them it's raining without consequence. We buy games to have a good time, so all this bullshit doesn't fly. This is what brought us to the breaking point. A complete lack of understanding between an industry that seems to hate its audience and gamers not willing to pay stupid prices to play stupid games. And it's not only us. Almost all the talented developers have run away from the big gaming companies. As a result, we are seeing the small studios they are creating and the indie world betting on gameplay and style again. Oh, and Nintendo, who learned from the N64 and the GameCube. I mean, they might be assholes, but they know what they are doing, and today they have the only console that feels special. And now Valve, the biggest name behind PC gaming, has put their bet on Linux and low-end devices. They care about selling games, and if I can even turn this 13-year-old Fire Hazard into a pretty decent indie machine, this puts gaming into the hands of almost anybody, making the market even bigger for less graphical demanding games. But all this only shows how most of the companies that can produce top-tier graphics have gone to shit. Not that graphics don't or can't work. So let's talk about why graphics will never work as they did before, even if the gaming industry wasn't a mess. Let's talk about the problem with graphics. For starters, they hit a point of minimal return. You need years and boatloads of money, which usually means depending on those sleazy investors who love to push politics, to make things look slightly better than 10 years ago. Which turns the issue from something technical into something psychological. Because what's killing the power of graphics is that they depend on novelty, and with novelty, slightly better will never cut it. I mean, novelty is just neuromarketing slang for tickling the circuit of our brains, wired to give us a dopamine hit when we spot and investigate anything new in the environment. It's basically the reason most ads scream, "It's new and improved." But novelty in media is a double-edged sword. It works great, but fades quick. And not only for that new thing, but also for anything that's too similar. Do you remember how animated films hyped realism until movies like Spirits Within and Avatar came out, and then the whole industry pivoted to style? That's novelty's curse. Realistic animation was mind-blowing the first time, then it becomes normal. Boring even. But gaming was amazing for this type of marketing. Graphics evolved fast enough to feel new all the time, but slowly enough not to reach their peak in decades. Let's say you were a horror fan in the golden era. You had Sweet Home, 5 years later Clock Tower, 5 more Code Veronica, and another 5 brought you Resident Evil 4. But today we are playing Resident Evil 4 Remake, so not only we are playing the same game, but the difference isn't that impressive. Especially if you keep in mind that the time gap between Sweet Home and Resident Evil 4 is smaller than between 4 and its remake. See the problem? It was never graphics that tickled your brain, it was the massive change. But we've reached a point where they can't improve enough to create the same level of impact. Even if they create true-to-life graphics, we'd be amazed for a while and then shrug. After all, you wake up every day to the best graphics in existence. Do you go, wow, such shadows, wow, such definition, he even farts in 8K? Of course not. This is why most visual industries now understand that for novelty you need to bet on style again, to feel different. But there's that tiny little detail. Graphics only need tech, while style needs talent and taking risks. And in the words of a great composer,
so if you don't love it, you're not going to take the risks.
But it's more than that.
Let me make it worse. Pushing graphics has always been about adding more detail, but we've gotten to a point where you can add so much that instead of improving the experience, it only adds an extra layer of fuckery. Just think about how our attention works. The more we focus on a task, the more our brains ignores information not tied to it. A famous study showed that half of us won't even see a bloody gorilla in front of the screen if we are focused counting passes. And gaming demands way more focus than that, so your brain is literally wasting energy to throw away almost all those fancy graphics during your gameplay. All that extra detail becomes noise. In other words, the more details you add, the more you screw the functional aspect of graphics. So most games pushing them will end up with the same problems. The amount of detail makes it hard to know where to go or what can we interact with, so they must use cheap tricks to go around this. Like making them extremely linear so the player can get lost, ending up with games that are basically pretty rooms and corridors with lots of closed doors, or extremely limited outdoors. And if they can't tie you to a small environment, they'll slap compasses, minimaps and pointers everywhere, making your cowboy or your witcher have better geolocation than a nuclear submarine. Which means that for hours, the beautiful graphics your attention will be focused on are this while you try to find your way. They also need to highlight or put the infamous yellow paint on everything you can interact with, or they'll say screw it and won't let you interact with almost anything, even if it feels stupid. Did your knife break and there is an axe there? Tough luck, that's the environment, so not touching, but I hope you appreciate how realistic it looks. Making games more detailed always gets to a point where they need to sacrifice gameplay, ending up with games that feel clunky, confusing and artificial. Good design understands how our attention works and makes use of it, while prioritizing readability over visual fidelity. Arcane is a great example of this. Almost every scene is made of a focal point and then some contextual information. The rest is just negative space. Everything on screen is there to tell you something. This type of design creates cognitive ease, which means that our brains love it as the job is done for them so they can focus on enjoying, and you can see it in video games too. Look at the glimpse we got for the new Mario Kart. Characters on the road are the focal point, so they are more detailed. Then we have a secondary area that gives the feel of the track, and the rest is as simple as it gets, even to the point of looking quite bad if you pay attention to it. But that's the thing, you won't. This is what I call pushing readability, and you'll see it on every single game that tries to maximize all three pillars to tell us something while making gameplay as smooth as possible. Just think about the games that you consider the most stylish, or even better, write them down, as I'd love to play them. Now, how many of those are graphic hogs? I can't think of any. The most beautiful games are usually some of the most efficient, readable and enjoyable all around, and they are usually very basic for good reason. Pushing graphics forces you to add a lot of detail and being almost limited to photorealism. I mean, you ain't selling many GPUs with pixel art. On the other hand, pushing readability means trying to remove all the detail that doesn't matter while having complete freedom when choosing styles. Which also means that pushing graphics today not only screws the functional pillar, it also limits the narrative and the aesthetic ones, as photorealism is the least flexible, least memorable, least sexy style of them all. And this is not me bashing it. It is brilliant, and some games need it, but our brains have a lot of bias towards anything that looks real. So what looks wrong looks twice as wrong, creating cognitive dissonance or the uncanny valley effect. This limits a lot how you can express things, while on other styles we don't have those biases. Just look at how much more this scene tells you in the original Lion King. And you probably didn't notice it's recorded at a resolution of 480p. Since this is easier to show than to tell, let's pick 3 masterpieces of design and put them side to side. Witcher 3, where they went all in with graphics, Tears of the Kingdom, which have bottom of the barrel graphics but went all in with style, and Elden Ring or any of the Souls games, which have mediocre graphics but went high in style. In Zelda, just a glance gives you the mood, the magical vibe, the hopeful feel and nostalgia of an interactive fairy tale. Elden Ring tells you as much, though this time you get a world that's broken, affected by beings that are beyond our understanding. It's sad, hopeless and dark, but oddly beautiful. Is it a wonder that the Souls series style has inspired a whole genre? No. Is it strange that so many games are trying to look like the Switch-era Zeldas? Not really. But what is the environment of Witcher telling you aside from basic beach early Renaissance Europe? Not much. And this is not a critique, it is exactly what it had to be. But notice how much the style has to be carried by the narrative. The tragic story of a man who just wanted to play cards, but was constantly distracted by the apocalypse. Still, if I ask you, which one of the three worlds do you think is the most beautiful? I wonder how many of you will choose the realistic one. And here's the thing, you cannot make Zelda or Elden Ring graphic hawks, because you'd break their essence, as both are focused on creating spectacular environments that are easy to read, to inspire exploration, so they need to feel a bit empty, a bit surreal. Not being tied to photorealism allows for more expression, more vibrancy, more radical animation, to convey movement in more spectacular ways. It's better at communicating space and what you can do. It's the best at creating emotional impact. And there is more. It's not only the lazy part of your brain which prefers less detail. The one related to your identity does too, as when they put all the detail for us, they break imaginative immersion. The more realistic and detailed something is, the less we put from our imagination into it. The less we put, the less special it feels as time goes by. It's why book people are always ranting about how the book is better than the movie. Because we create our own movie as we read it, and we also do this with less defined visual information. We look for shapes in clouds, we are terrified of what we can't see, and we rebuild those less defined video games in our minds while we are playing. I mean, have you ever played a game from your childhood and got surprised at how bad it actually looked? That's reality smashing against the memories of the version you created while playing it. Plus, brains are tickled by things they cannot completely see or understand. The liminal, the ethereal, the strange. Raw graphics can make something look good, but they can't make it look special. You make it special. And the more you put of yourself into it, the more special it is. And I'm not saying they can't do this with amazing graphics. It's just going to take a lot more effort. They are way more limited in the choices they can make. And most of the time they'll have to hide those graphics under a layer of style. But this rarely happens for what I consider to be the biggest problem with pushing graphics, how it forces creators to give away control. If every stone, tree and strand of grass has to be perfect, they must use software to model and create more stuff in procedural ways, as it's impossible to have humans doing all the work. So we are ending up with games where environments, lighting and most stuff is created with little human input.
And the procedural systems aren't just placing trees and rocks, but also fog cards, bugs, birds, everything that's needed to bring this environment to life.
And now with the AI push, this is only going to get worse, as you can bet most big companies are drooling while thinking about an era of games where the music, writing, models and almost everything is designed by a machine, which is bloody disgusting and the curse of our time. So yes, all this is what made graphics lose their magic, but you know what? I'm optimistic. I believe we are still going to get the best looking games ever, and I want big companies to keep pushing graphics even further, because it always trickles down. Yes, I think the way they use them sucks, but who knows, maybe in the future someone will create a game that expresses everything through light and shadow using path tracing. And have you seen what they are doing with retro games with it? That's what makes me excited. Besides, it's the best time to be a gamer. You can have all the great titles of the past for pennies and play them on a potato, while the indie world is mind-blowing. So let them cook. We'll see where it goes. Meanwhile, I'll keep recommending weird stuff. But what do you think about all this? I want to know.